So we're here at the Walden Pond State Reservation. We're standing in front of a replica of the cabin that Henry David Thoreau built. He came to Walden Woods in the spring of 1845. The cabin that he built shows up in his book, Walden, as an example of his ideas of self-sufficiency, his resourcefulness, the idea of living to meet only his most essential needs. But he's doing various things here at the cabin. At the end of the 1830s, he took a boat trip with his brother John up the Concord River, and they made their way to the Middlesex Canal, which allowed them to go around Lowell to the Merrimack River, and they continued on. It was actually a 2-week trip that he condenses down to 1 week later on. He's taking the notes from that trip and turning it into his first book. The other thing that he's doing is mourning his brother. His brother died in 1842, not too long after their boat trip. This is not the wilderness, as we'll talk about more, but it is removed from the center of town and allowed Henry David Thoreau to have some time alone, some solitude. Let's take a look at the cabin itself and give you a sense of what it was like for Henry David Thoreau to live here. He's trying to demonstrate to people in the early 19th century, with the Industrial Revolution beginning, American capitalism evolving, that there was another way of living, and one in which freedom would still be an important part of how people understood themselves and arranged their lives. In here in the cabin, you can see it's fairly small, but not, entirely a cramped space for one person. This is his bed. He does have a wood stove to heat the room during the wintertime. And this is a writing desk. This is where he wrote the book A Week on the Concord and Merrimack River that did not sell very well. In fact, he ended up with hundreds of copies of his own that no one else wanted. But he's keeping a journal here too, probably sometimes writing at this desk, maybe sometimes outside, that he mines for the book Walden. It's not necessarily the grand mansion that Ralph Waldo Emerson lived in, and that in fact he is the owner of the land where the cabin that Henry David Thoreau built. But it is it's roomy enough for him. This is not wilderness. It is a wooded area when Henry David Thoreau comes, but it has been logged several times by the time he gets here. There are also farms and pastures and orchards all around. In fact, if he had looked at the horizon, it would have looked much lower then than it does now because there was not as much of a forest in the region. So this is the site of Thoreau's cabin. The size of it, you can see, is very similar to the cabin replica that we looked at. This is the front door where we walked in, the actual replica. There was a fireplace here as well as a wood stove and a chimney. This is the actual chimney foundation. The bed was over here, the desk was over here. There's a root cellar underneath. Behind the house, the site of the woodshed, which is marked out here by these 4 stones. The other thing, of course, is the pond. The pond is right down this path. Henry David Thoreau could walk out his front door, or sit in fact, on his step of his front door and see the water. And there's a set of train tracks behind this hill, which had actual trains running on them while he was here. So he would be hearing trains from the place where he was in his cabin. And then there are roads over to the other side of the cabin that would have had a lot of traffic on them. So he would be hearing people driving stagecoaches, walking, having conversations. Like I said, this is not a wilderness where he's living. He is alone, he has some solitude, but he's definitely seeing the activity of human life going on. And he could walk to town from here fairly easily, as he did, to visit his family, to visit Ralph Waldo Emerson, other friends, and that also meant that he had contact with people and wasn't just entirely sort of a hermit. Thoreau also made a point to mention in the book Walden, which he published in 1854, that he's living very close to a community of formerly enslaved African Americans. And this is something that is discussed in a book, Black Walden, by Elise Lemire. She's writing, "Although I was surprised and delighted by Thoreau's poetry and his puns, I was completely unprepared for the chapter in Walden entitled Former Inhabitants and Winter Visitors, in which he describes the outcasts who lived in Walden Woods prior to his arrival. Half of them were former African American and African slaves. Thoreau carefully describes the bean field he planted during his Walden stay as situated in a landscape marked by their presence. To the east of his bean field, which would have been over here, was a cellar hole where the home of Cato Ingraham used to stand, formerly the slave of Duncan Ingraham. Cato was said by some locals to be a Guinea or African Negro. By the corner of Thoreau's bean field, still nearer to town, a colored woman named Zilpha, which is also the name that we think her name was Zilpah White. She lived in a little house where she spun linen for the townsfolk. Down the road on the right hand, Thoreau continues, lived Brister Freeman and his wife Fenda. Brister was the slave of Squire Cummings once. This area, even though he's planting a bean field here, was also sort of known as being a place with fairly poor soil. Those two things together, the fact that there's a community of African Americans here and the poor soil, meant few white inhabitants wanted to live in the vicinity. This means that the spaces that Thoreau identified as so-called wild, or at least that maybe we would call today green, were also black spaces. That racial segregation, racism and racial segregation are part of what explain the kind of nature that Thoreau encountered when he lived here. One of the things that happened while Henry David Thoreau was living in his cabin on Walden Pond was the Mexican-American War, which he understood as being about expanding slavery. This, of course, produced the celebrated event when he refused to pay a tax and he was jailed briefly, and his aunt came to bail him out of jail. He used that as material for a lecture on the duty of civil disobedience that then became an essay. Later, when John Brown came through town to get funding for his planned raid on the Federal Arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Transcendentalists greeted him, were very supportive, and in fact 5 of the Secret Six came from their ranks. Henry David Thoreau, like other Transcendentalists, understood that John Brown, who was hanged for the failed raid that he organized, was a martyr to the cause of abolition. He wrote in an essay, A Plea for Captain John Brown, "The man was a Transcendentalist above all, a man of ideas and principles. He did not recognize unjust human laws, but resisted them as he was bid."